So, Julie, we're back with some more marriage myths, and we're excited to have you help us debunk these today.
I'm looking forward to it.
So our first marriage myth that we mentioned in the intro is one that I hear all the time, and it's the myth of never go to bed angry. What are your thoughts?
Well, you do hear it a lot, and there is scripture that says, don't let the sun go down on your wrath, right?
Yeah.
The problem with that is, let's just say that you have some type of conflict in the evening. And maybe like me, your brain kind of begins shutting down around 8 o'clock, 8:30, and you're kind of done for the day. If you start trying to talk about complicated matters at that moment in time, chances are the conversation is not going to go very well. And so what we like to encourage couples to think about is if you go to bed and you're angry at your spouse and your spouse has no idea you're angry at them, that's a problem. If you sit down and say, I'm really frustrated about the conversation that we just had, and I don't think I can really have a coherent conversation at this moment, but I would like to talk with you tomorrow and figure out maybe some things that we could do differently. It actually sets the tone to allow you to be able to rest for the night. I love you. We're in the midst of something. We're not going to solve it tonight. We're committed to talking about it tomorrow. And that does allow you to say, I love you, to pray together, to sleep, and then get up refreshed and have a conversation. Now, maybe you're two late night people and like that's your time, then great. Just make sure that it's a constructive conversation that you're having and not something that's going to keep you up all night and you're going to be angry into the next day about whatever it is you're dealing with.
That's such a great point because I feel like when you are exhausted, the last thing you need to be doing is trying to duel out and kind of hash out the difficult conversations that you're needing to have. But it sounds like being intentional about maybe even setting a time to come back, saying like, hey, we're both in a place where we're tired, but let's revisit this tomorrow. That intentionality can really help in that conversation, it sounds like.
Well, I think you make a great point in that you could be tired at 7:30 in the morning. Like you could have a lot going on and you know your brain isn't doing well. There have been plenty of times where Jay and I have had conversations and he'll say to me, I can't do this right now because I'm very distracted thinking about some other things. So can we talk about this tonight after dinner, or we just need to do it at a later time because I'm not all here. I appreciate that a lot. And I think that that's helpful in marriages because if you're not all there or you're distracted, you've got other stuff going on, chances are good that the conversation is going to go south because your spouse is going to know you're not all fully present. And if you really want to be constructive in dealing with conflict, you will be all in. Everybody all in for the conversation.
Yeah, it's like bringing the best version of yourself to the conversation so that you can move forward in a healthy way.
Yes, I love that.
So jumping into our second myth, and this goes hand in hand with the conflict conversation of healthy marriages are conflict-free. Thoughts on that one?
Wow. I have worked with lots of marriages and I've never encountered one. Well, that's not true. I've actually had people say to me, we don't ever have conflict. But then on the side, they'll say to me, we don't have conflict because it's not worth the price I would pay to bring it up. And my response to that is, so you're going along to get along? Yes. And the problem with that is that doesn't bring a healthy and fulfilling relationship because someone feels like they're not being heard and they're not being well cared for. So when you think about conflict in a marriage actually can increase intimacy when it's handled well. You're going to go through life and you are going to encounter difficult things. You might have disagreements about the children how to parent them, or what activities to be involved in, or what your in-laws or your own parents have to say about your marriage, like allowing them to speak into your marriage. There's lots of things that can create conflict in a marriage. So I would say that a conflict-free marriage, I would ask you, what kind of relationship do you have? It's hard to be in relationship with someone, true, healthy relationship, and never have any kind of conflict. It's what you do with the conflict that is very impactful to your marriage.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say like even just the process of rebuilding after conflict just builds so much intimacy when it comes to your relationship. Like there's a whole nother level of communication that you have to get to build back from conflict.
Well, and when you think about doing that, and it's like, high five, we just got through that. And that was really hard. It was a hard conversation, and tears were shed, and we were just laying ourselves out there. But it felt good because we were being honest, and nobody trounced on each other's heart. They received the information and were wholeheartedly seeking to figure out, well, what's our best way forward as a team? What's our best way forward? I mean, if you feel like you have to have the last word or somebody wins, then your relationship lost.
Yeah. And like when you recover from conflict, you almost have evidence for your relationship that you can go through something like that and come out stronger on the other side. And so when you have future conflicts, it's nice knowing like, hey, we've done this before. Like we have our reps. Like we know we can get through this. And so then you're not as willing to try to bury it or kind of shovel it under a rug or something like that.
Well, and I think too, it's this idea of believing the best in your spouse and wanting the best for your marriage. And so you might be having a disagreement about money or whatever, but if you go into it with this mindset of, well, we have different perspectives, but we both are for our marriage. And so therefore, we can stay at the table and we can figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Moving on to our next marriage myth. Getting married helps couples in struggling marriages.
No. That's the quick answer.
Yeah.
The bigger answer is, if you're struggling in your relationship before marriage and you don't address those issues, or you just find that you're very different. I mean, I think one of the hardest things is to really, really love somebody and know that you need to walk away because you can't change them, and it would not be healthy for you to be in marriage with them.
Yeah.
So you want to show up with your healthiest version of you, and the person that you're marrying, the healthiest version of themselves. And if one of you isn't willing to work on things, or you're really like vinegar and oil all the time, putting a ring on a finger will not make things better.
Yeah.
So the best time to do the work is before you get married. Because if you think that putting the ring on the finger, you're going to be able to do like a home improvement project on your spouse once you get married, you are sorely mistaken and will be very disappointed.
Yeah, I think there's this thinking that when you get married, you're magically going to transform into different people.
No, it just gets bigger.
I think for me, like when I got married, one of the most surprising things is just how similar you feel. Like you're married and your life looks a little bit different, but like you're the same person.
Yes, you are.
And so don't expect your spouse to be a different person when you get married.
No.
And I think there's so much truth in that.
Or don't expect that you are going to do an extreme makeover on them.
Yeah.
Because I've seen a lot of relationships where the husband or wife thought, well, I will definitely have more say-so, and I'll be able to help them change. But we all know that, like, if we don't think it's a problem and we don't want to change, we're not going to change. And so now you just have more of the same.
Yeah. Kind of in the same vein, another marriage myth that we had is having children will fix a broken marriage.
Yeah, having children will just bring more stress to an already stressful situation. When children come into the picture, I mean, I love children, but they require a lot of people. And I don't think couples often consider the changes that are going to happen when a baby comes. They keep you up at night and they need to be fed and diapers need to be changed. And it feels non-stop. So bringing that into a troubled marriage just makes you more stressed and creates a lot more challenges. If you're struggling, get help.
Yeah.
And get on the other side of those things that are creating angst for you in your relationship before you think about having a child. The other piece of that is that when you're stressed and you're tense and you're feeling angst with each other, infants, newborns pick up on that. And as a result, they're anxious and they're stressed. So lots more crying, hard to console them, which makes more stress. And it's hard to console the parents because they're at their wits' end. So that is definitely not true.
Yeah. And I mean, we talked about in our first marriage myth of having conflict when you're tired. Imagine having a kid and you're tired 24/7 and having to deal with the conflict that already existed in your marriage.
Yes. I can remember having Ashley as a baby and just being in tears because I was exhausted and I just was at my wit's end. And Jay came and was like, let me take her and you go to sleep.
Yeah.
So it's important that you're a team and that you're both willing to do whatever it takes to care for that child and care for each other.
That's so good. Moving on to our next marriage myth. Differences will ruin your marriage.
Differences are the spice of life. I mean, when you think about marriage, if you have two people and they are exactly alike, how boring.
How boring.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when people talk about, opposites attract,
yeah,
it is true because I think we often look for something a little bit different. And I would definitely say Jay and I are opposite. However, the foundational things we are very much aligned on. Mm-hmm. But it is those differences. When we leverage those, we are humming on all cylinders.
Yeah.
So recognizing that the differences in your spouse, being able to look at those and go, oh, that's great. Like money is your thing. It is not mine. Or like, I don't like household chores any more than Jay does. And so figuring out together, well, that's a similarity. We don't like them, but we're going to figure out how to do that together versus saying, well, that's yours. You have to do all of that. Differences, man, they can create a lot of havoc in your marriage if you don't figure out how to make them work for your marriage.
Yeah. And I think when you first get married, you have this tendency to think everyone thinks the exact same that you do.
I know.
And then you step into marriage and you realize, oh, people are different than I am. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just an interesting journey of understanding that your spouse is going to be different than you and they have different preferences and different personality traits and things like that. And so much of marriage is learning those and then learning how to love those the best way that you can.
I have a really good friend who talks all the time about different isn't deficient.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of times we think it is. Like if you don't think like me or you don't do conflict like I do, then something's wrong with you.
For sure. Yeah.
And different is definitely not deficient. It's just different. And instead of thinking of it and looking down on your spouse or thinking less of them, really recognizing, okay, it's just different and we have to figure out how to dance together well. And that's part of the thing of coming together is you're going to step on each other's toes from time to time and figuring out how to do that less by appreciating the differences and letting them work for your relationship. And that's powerful.
Yeah. And I love the dance analogy because I mean, you're not going to meet someone for the first time and try to dance together and be perfect at it.
Correct.
And if you do it for 50 years, you're going to be great at it, you know? And so it's just so much of learning over time. And part of it is just acknowledging that it takes time to get to that point. Like you're not going to be there week one of your marriage, you know?
Well, and I also think it's not taking yourself too seriously. Jay and I were having a conversation just a couple of weeks ago, and we were actually having multiple conversations, except for he would start a conversation with me in the kitchen, and then he'd walk out of the kitchen and walk to another part of the house. And the fifth time, I'm like, you have started like 5 different conversations with me, and you walk away every single time. And I mean, without missing a beat, he walks in the kitchen and he goes, "You've taught me well." And I'm like, okay. Duly noted. So it's just learning to not take yourselves too seriously, to be able to laugh at yourself and to acknowledge, you know what, you are so right about that. And I'm going to work on it.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
for sure. And when you come at it from the mindset of like, we're on the same team,
yeah.
you know what you're working towards.
Right.
So that's super great.
Yes.
Marriage counseling is a last resort.
Ooh. I would say marriage counseling is a great thing. I can actually remember being in school and being required to do counseling as part of my education. And I thought, man, this is the best thing ever. Like I'm getting to sit with someone and I get to talk about all my stuff and they have to listen. And, you know, it was healthy for me. And I think it's healthy for all of us. If you find yourself in a place where like you're doing well, and maybe you want to take your marriage to the next level, that's a great time to go to counseling. Truthfully, the hardest time to do counseling is when you're at odds with each other. And I'm not saying don't do it. You should totally do it. But when you're not at odds, there's less cortisol coursing through your body. You're much more likely to be in tune with each other and be open to listening about, hey, this is hard for me. Would you entertain us talking about doing it differently? It's easier, way easier to have conversations with each other when you're not on the struggle bus. So I would say look at counseling as an option throughout the duration of your marriage, and especially when you feel like, gosh, you know, we're doing really well. We'd like to take our marriage to the next level, and it would be helpful to have a third party to help us do that. And if you find yourself experiencing angst and you cannot figure out a way forward, do not wait. Like, don't let tons of time lapse, because you can do a lot of damage to your marriage relationship by waiting and then going and asking for help. And it isn't that your marriage can't be helped. It isn't that you can't get out of the ditch, but it's going to take a lot more time and effort and energy to get out of the ditch at that point.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the things that's interesting is in the conversations I've had with couples, when they talk about counseling, the first thing they always say is, we wish we did this 20 years ago.
Yes.
Because you think about in marriage, when it comes to conflict, so much of the conflict that you have is the same conflict that just happens over and over and over again. And counseling is a great opportunity to address that conversation head on in a super intentional way.
Yes.
And so that way you don't look back and say, man, if we had just addressed this thing 20 years ago, we'd have been in so much of a better place than we are now.
Yeah, there's so much truth to that. I've had a lot of couples say the same.
Great. Moving on to our very last marriage myth. Every disagreement must have a resolution. Thoughts?
Oh, mercy. Actually, research shows that there's 10 things that couples will probably disagree on for the duration of their marriage. And the good news about that is that you're normal, right? You're sitting here thinking, oh, good, okay. The reality is you're going to have disagreements on things like money, sex, in-laws, career, and the list goes on throughout the duration of your marriage. And some of them you're not going to come to a complete resolution. You're going to figure out how to work with it together. I can remember parenting Ashley, like we were on the same page about a whole lot of things, but there were some things that just drove Jay crazy. And it was a different perspective for me. And so we would have conversations around that because I didn't want him to be driven crazy. I certainly didn't want our child to be disrespectful or not respect authority. And so we would have conversations around, okay, how are we going to do this together? You have this perspective, I have a different one, but let's figure out how we move forward together. And I think, honestly, that's the key.
Yeah, because it's only natural when you and your spouse come from two different backgrounds and two different perspectives, two different ways of life, and then trying to blend those, it's not realistic that you're going to be aligned on every single conversation that you have.
No.
I guess like the tricky thing is when you get to that moment of, okay, let's have this conversation, let's get some form of alignment.
Yes.
What does that look like?
Well, I think for one, the question is, how am I honoring my spouse and how am I honoring the Lord? To me, those are the two biggies. Is how do we do this and be respectful of each other, honoring of our marriage and honoring of the Lord? And sometimes that's being really prayerful and trying to figure out solutions together. It requires brainstorming. It may take time. Like it may not be something that you're going to figure out a solution for in a day or in a week. It may be over a period of time that you're having ongoing conversation. You're seeking more information so that you can make a wise decision about how you're going to agree to move forward. I can remember when Jay and I got married, he just has a saver mentality with money, which is wonderful. And I wouldn't tell you I had a spending mentality, but I definitely had a different perspective about money. And it took us some time to have conversations about, hey, actually taking a trip together is a good thing for our marriage versus necessarily putting all that money into a savings account. We don't have to get crazy with a trip, but doing that could be good for our marriage. And that was it was a new learning for both of us. And I mean, that's just one example. There's all kinds of things that over time in marriage, you're going to figure out how to navigate, but you aren't necessarily 100% on the same page.
Yeah. And it almost comes back to that point that we were talking about earlier in our conversation of recognize you're on the same team. And if you recognize that, the rest of this gets so much easier.
It does.
And you understand that your spouse isn't trying to work against you. Like you are both in the same boat rowing together. You just might be at different speeds at the moment.
Yes. And you might have been brought up with very different perspectives on certain things. And that's the mystery. You get to come together and figure it out and put some boundaries in play and have the conversations. It's the unspoken things that really have the potential to derail the relationship. So you might disagree about something and you could say, I don't have the same take on that. And I can respect that.
Yeah. Well, Julie, that's a great word. And thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. Make sure you tune in next week for the next edition of the WinShape Marriage Podcast.
Have a marriage question you'd like answered on the show? We'd love to hear from you. Visit winshapemarriage.org/podcast to submit your question today.